It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much for the organizers of this conference for the invitation. This moment, this space has been thought as a public talk, so for you to put questions, to debate. But nonetheless, I wanted to introduce very few ideas, to put on your consideration for your debate. The first one is that after observing the transformation of public spaces in European cities, and particularly in Barcelona, for several decades, is more and more important the relation between the redesign of public space and mobility issues. For instance, here we have an image of one of the important streets in Barcelona at the beginning of the 80s, invaded by cars with lack of urbanization. And at this moment, it was transformed. The aim of the transformation was to produce a civic main street. So it was an idea of civism, of collective place of social place, not about mobility. The concern, even if there were cars, the concern was not about mobility. And for many decades, almost all the street network of the city of Barcelona has been designed or redesigned several times. So there was this dialogue between infrastructure, between mobility, between transport, and between redesign. But at this moment, this is an image of the current master plan, the plan which is under development for the metropolis. And we see that, again, the mobility issues have more and more importance for the redesign of public space. But it's a mobility which is not to introduce cars as 50 years ago, but it's this idea of sustainable mobility, which is removing cars, continuing the removal of cars from the city. So, but what's important is that the aims, the goals of these mobility strategies are not about social spaces, but mainly about sustainable goals. Sustainable to fight, to reduce gas emissions, to fight against climate change, to other goals, to reduce air pollution, and so on. So, today I wanted to put on your consideration 4 topics of the consequence of these mobility approaches, these sustainable mobility approaches, on the redesign of public spaces at this moment in Barcelona and in several European cities. The first one is not the starting reduction, but completing the reduction of the presence of cars in public space and the change that it makes for the pedestrianization, for most of the streets to become pedestrian. For instance, here we have the distribution mode, which is between 2011 and 2018. The cars, it's in red, would go only at this moment about 15%. This is the goal, about 15% of the modes of transportation. This means that if you look here, this morning in Professor Purjafar's presentation, we have seen a picture that in Tehran, in the street space, more than 99% of the space is dedicated to cars. In Barcelona, at the beginning of the 80s, was, for the cars, 75%. At this moment, we have reached the balance about 50-50, the space between pedestrian, bicycles, and the space for cars. And the aim is to achieve 75% of the space street for pedestrians. This would be it's not a very, very important change, because these streets were conceived in the 19th century for this balance, about 50-50. Now it could be a completely new streetscape if we achieve this 75%. So some images, Now is the grid of the streets, where most of the streets are shared street between the car and all the different transport modes. And this is the idea, to define super blocks, and then in the inner streets, almost no traffic would exist. So it has been starting implementing this situation. This makes the presence of cars at this moment in the city, and the result would be a minor presence of cars. This is a first situation, to say what we could do with the streetscape if we continue this redesign process, with advantages about air quality and urban noise problems. But we have this idea, how to use the streets, but not the small streets of the historical downtowns, the historical center, but the regular streets of the grid, for new uses, civic uses, or maybe to reintroduce the greenery to the city, with vegetable gardens and so on. So this is the first aspect. What happens if we continue with the reduction of cars? This would change completely the streetscape and the landscape, the urban landscape we see in our cities. The second one is this idea that to reduce the presence of cars is very important to develop the transportation system. What happens with the transportation system as a project of urbanity, as an opportunity to enhance urban projects? For instance, if this happens with the ground floor transportation systems, not so much with underground, for instance, metro lines or subways, which can be very efficient in terms of mobility, but when we have a transportation like a tramway on the ground floor, is an opportunity to regenerate many urban areas. So this is an example. We could find many examples in France and in many other, or in Austria, in many other European countries. The opportunity of the introduction of a tramway to redesign. Here we can have the cross-section before the redesign, and then the opportunity to change. Yes. To take advantage of the implementation of a new transport system, not only for the improvements on mobility terms, but to redesign all the public space around. Also this idea between, in peripheries, the opportunity of heterogeneous areas to bring them a unity, a continuity, and so on. Or in these tramways, also the appearance of strategic places that can make possible the development of urban projects to activate these areas. One of these areas, in the intersection between the new tramway line and the railway station, so it's the opportunity to rechange to redesign all the public space of the area. So the second idea to put into your consideration are these: the urban opportunities of the implementation of new ground transportation lines. The third one is this idea, the mobility hubs as collective places. This morning we saw in the Professor Purjafar presentation also the idea that the most important public spaces nowadays are the metro stations. So it's this idea, for many years, the mobility hubs, like train stations or metro stations, must be considered not only places of interchange of mobility, of flows, but also places for social encounter, for social activity, and so on. This is so for many years. We can have here a picture of the Randstad, which is one of the areas in Europe where there has been higher coordination between urban planning, so the planning of activities, and transportation planning. So for a mobility hub to become really a collective place, there are several conditions, and one of the conditions is this balance between accessibility, intermodality, but also some factors that depend on the planning of activities, like density, intensity, mixed use. So it's necessary to have this coordination between transport and planning policies to achieve the right conditions for a mobility hub to become a collective place. But these conditions, when these conditions happen, is not enough for this process to become. It's also need a good urban design. So we could have the conditions in the area, but if the different components of the city are not related, but the architectural and urban design, the collective place doesn't emerge. So for instance, we have seen a picture of the station of Utrecht. This is one of the central stations of Den Haag. So an example of how in these complex sections, the different uses, the different levels of the city, the intermodality, take shape in a really collective space. But what I would like to add is that at this moment, these mobility hubs, the program of these mobility hubs is becoming more and more complex. For instance, in this idea of the appearance of urban sales nodes, the appearance in some parts of the city of places to manage all the environmental systems. For instance, the water with new technology, the water supplies, the waste, the energies, and so on. No? So there are new hubs, which are not mobility hubs, but are in some way environmental hubs that will appear in the city and that could be related to the mobility hubs. No? So making more complex the program of these mobility hubs. This is an example, no? In a crossroad of Barcelona, how the different environmental elements of energy, of waste, of recycling, of supplies, of mobility also could be put together. And this is an example of a mobility house in a study done by Volkswagen and Arup, in how to say the car companies are assuming that the number of cars in the future of mobility, at least in Europe, will be reduced and quite soon. So maybe we have to think in new ways of mobility, mobility by autonomous cars, mobility by car sharing. So this will need new services, which will not be the private car parkings in the city, but maybe this idea of mobility houses where the different services for cars and for autonomous cars and car sharing could be concentrated. So what I mean by this is that another opportunity in these synergies between mobility and public space redesign is the location of these complex functional programs that combine transportation, environmental, new mobility demands in some places of the city that will change. The design will change depending if we are in the suburban area next to the sprawl with the park and rides, in the metropolitan ring, in the ring core, and so on. No? So it's a new field of thinking the redesign of these mobility hubs. And finally, last but not least, is this idea of soft mobility, low speed mobility modes like bicycle, running, walking, related to green infrastructure. No? This idea of green infrastructure is another important sustainable concept that includes all the network of open spaces in the metropolis, no? Both urban public spaces, but also the large metropolitan geographical spaces. No? Is in this idea and to incorporate some facilities to respond to the environmental demands of the metropolis. No? But this idea to link the urban public spaces within the city with the mountains, with the rivers, with the natural features, the geographical features around the city, no? With these green corridors. So this is an example of this kind of spaces that can be many times waste spaces in between infrastructure, in between industrial areas, and that can be reused, can be redesigned to have three functions, no? Productive functions of proximity agriculture, biodiversity function, an ecological function, and also a leisure function, no? To become new spaces for social use. In these spaces, in the morning we were talking about pause and movement spaces. These are spaces mainly of motion, spaces to be lived by cycling, and therefore here in terms of mobility and redesign we have to think about the possibility to produce gates with public transportation to access this area, but at the same time to produce all these lanes to bike, to live this big scale, these greater scale spaces in movement. No? So I wanted before you to put questions not only on this short intervention, but on the interventions of Tony Bosch and Professor Flon. The name in Austrian is more complicated. So we will have some minutes of debate, but to think that in our context, these four issues are important: the completing the reduction of cars in the city, the creation of new mobility hubs with a very complex functional program, this idea of green infrastructures with soft mobility modes. And the second one is the opportunities of redesign that involve the implementation of transportation systems on the ground floor. No? So many opportunities to think that the paradigm of mobility is not anymore the paradigm of 50 years ago to introduce more cars. It's a paradigm of sustainable mobility, that more and more the redesign of the public space in the city is driven by this paradigm of sustainable mobility, and we have to think about positive effects, opportunities in this paradigm of sustainable mobility and the transformation of our public space, no? Considering that streets and squares, beside parks and beside other kind of public spaces, the street network is one of the main public space of any city and any metropolis. So now is the moment for questions, for debate. Okay. Thank you. Professor Noflacher. I don't know if I, no, I sorry for before. Thank you. So if there is any question, I say not about my intervention, but about the three last presentations were concerning mobility and public space. So a very important issue. Thinking about the Tehran situation or any question? You will have.
Sorry, Dr. Piran, as what you've talked about is my own interest. You've talked about public space. I don't know where you are. Are you here? He's not here. Okay.
Who are you looking for?
Hi, Dr. Parviz Piran.
Ah.
No, he's not here.
I don't know. He's not here.
No, I cannot ask questions.
Yes.
I think he has left the conference. Yes? He's not here. He has left the conference. Sorry.
Okay. About the superblock idea, to explain, okay. I think I have only, well, this is a, so the very simple diagram, no, is this idea that well, here we are in the center of Barcelona where the blocks are very regular, but this could work in any other neighborhood. No? The idea is that the inner streets that we can see here, we define some areas. The perimeter streets are used for traffic passing through and public transportation. And then, as you can see, the inner areas, there is only entrance for emergencies or for the neighborhoods, no, by car. So it's the way to really reduce in many of the, here we can see map of Barcelona. Now it's nowadays situation where there are no superblocks. Following the superblocks, big areas of the city would have this important reduction of cars, and where the possibility, but I say not only in the regular areas but also in the upper neighborhoods, no, in the northern neighborhoods, which are more irregular. So this is a controversial idea. But in this moment it's starting to being implemented. No, there are several superblocks. The first one here and a second one on the other side of the old town. I think it's controversial in part depending on this would going to free more than 6 million square meters in the town. So it's a huge amount of new public space, and so it would be important to know what to do with this public space. And so I think part of the controversy is to say, well, these streets were really conceived at this moment as a modern street to have this balance 50-50. Why to change them to a new balance 80-20? And which kind of uses and which sense it's not clear what kind of public space we will have in this area. But the opportunities, it's in the paradigm of greening the city, no? So maybe to introduce more, not only the typical trees of a line street tree, but to have more vegetable carpet, no, with the possibility of expanding the vegetable gardens managed by private people, no, auto-managed. So it opens many opportunities, no? But I mean, it's not, yes, I think that the concept of the superblock, it's about this idea of cell, of urban cell, and it should be complemented with the idea of urban network, no? At this moment, the people implementing the idea of the superblock is thinking in terms of cell. So if we manage to think the role in an urban network of the new civic or green uses that we can introduce to the public spaces, we could balance this model, no?
Good afternoon. Fábio Lima from Brazil. I ask you, Professor, about how you are thinking about the problem of the relationship in the public space between people and the water.
And water.
The water. And also the problem of parking cars in this urban scale.
Water, it depends, well, it is important in public space. It's very important, the cultural context, no? And I mean, here we are talking particularly in a dry context. So water, for instance, for us, water, it depends. Water, this could be very important, this change on the streets, for instance, in terms of environmental, of all the cycle of water, no? Instead to make possible the permeabilization, no, of the water through the streets, which now is not possible. So it would have very, in terms of rainy and the cycle of water, very important effects. About the parking issue. So it's really the question now in Barcelona is how to use, they are starting thinking how to reuse all the private parkings existing in the city, thinking that maybe in 20 or 30 years they will be completely empty. If the people doesn't have anymore the private car, but we are all using autonomous car-shared cars, well, what we are going to use, maybe we will need some, as I said, some mobility houses for these cars, these shared cars, but there will be many parkings, underground parkings now existing in the city that will have no use, no? So it's a question of how to reuse this parking, no? So yes, we are moving in this. Yes.
Karl Ludwig from Germany. Once more back to the superblocks. How do the people think about this idea of superblocks? Are they willing to accept this? And the second first of the question was, are they willing to give up their cars? You partly answered already.
Yes, I like it in Tony Bosch's presentation, no? This idea that mobility is a part of governance, not only infrastructure governance, but also the leg of culture and education. No? This is very important to change the mind and to accept some changes. No? At this moment, the first super block is the neighborhoods are not very happy with it because they prefer to, but they prefer to have an easy access by car because the city continues to work by cars nowadays, no? To have an easy access to their homes or even for instance, the libraries, no? It's another problem, the easy way of the library goods. But this is changing, no? I think the logistics of the library is going to leave a deep change in the next decades with hubs also, no? Hubs where the goods will arrive from other places, and then a micro distribution in the city, sometimes by bike or by soft modes. So, we wait to see. For the moment, the policy continues to be to implement new pilot superblocks. No? To see, but it's very soon to consider to have an assessment of this policy. No? Yes, you could have 100%, so a total pedestrianization. I think now, we saw this morning, Tehran is at 99% of presence of cars. So to achieve, not only in historical districts, no, with narrow streets, but in important avenues, to remove all cars. So maybe it could be possible, but I don't think even it would be necessary or good. No, there are some streets, some avenues that have been conceived already for the motorized transportation, and so I think, but 75–80% of pedestrian dedicated to pedestrians in the street, I think it's a success. Yes. Yes, I mean that there are several kinds of public spaces, but one of them is the network of streets, yes, of streets and square, and particularly in a Mediterranean city, it's a very important public space. And yes.
I was asked to give some comments by the lady before. I think the Dutch have a lot of experiences in the woonherbs. I think they have implemented the woonherbs in the 70s already, which is a similar principle as we have here in the superblocks. But they don't have, like most of the other countries, we don't have this grid network in our cities. So it is not a superblock, but the kind of woonherbs. Concerning parking, Vienna has, we have carried out the principles in the 70s. They have been implemented beginning from the 90s. What does it mean? In Vienna, you don't get any parking place for free in most of the districts. 16 of 23 districts, or 17 in the meantime, have implemented this new principle of parking. So if you are going with a car from another district to another district, then you are a foreigner, or if you're coming from somewhere, this means you are short-term parker and you have to pay €2.1 every hour. First of all, then we are, as you have shown you, we are removing thousands of parking places from public space by replacing it by more city-conform or agreeable use. And then we have, the city has started to develop car-free parts of the new cities. So if new cities are planned, then they should be planned without cars. And some of the examples have been really implemented, so we had to change the law, otherwise you cannot do it, because everything what administration is doing need a legal background. This has happened in the late 80s, and it works very well. So there was no backlash from these situations, but the money which has been used for parking is now used for common purposes, for green areas, for gardens on the roof, for cycling and for shared cars. So per 30 people, one car is about the best figure for shared mobility using cars. So one car for 30 people is what Switzerland has experienced. I think Germany has the same kind of experience, and we have a similar situation. But Vienna is not very strong concerning cars because our public transport is so good. So 95% of the people have accessibility within 5 minutes with a very good functioning transport system, and the public transport system consists of metros. Vienna has a very old history with the trams, but the situation in the 60s was totally different. At the end of the 60s, the city has decided to remove all the trams from the surface, because this was the direction toward the car mobility. Future mobility will car use, but today we are building cars and we are removing cars from the city. So we are cleaning the cities from cancerous cells. And I think this is the important thing, because as long as you have the old standards, you are always making, at least as an administrator, you are always making the wrong things. So in principle, if you provide space for cars for easy use, then you are in principle in the long term killing somebody. And this is not a good job for an engineer. To know what you are doing is killing people. And we know it today. So I think therefore I've introduced for the civil engineering, for the engineering faculties, I have started in 2004 a lecture, Ethics for Technicians. This is not only guidelines, it's much more. And this, I think, is important to know for engineers. We have an excellent introduction this afternoon, going into the philosophy, culture, and something like that. I think I enjoyed it very much. It is always not enough time to discuss the most interesting thing, but I can congratulate you for this composition. This is really stimulating, and I think the young people, this is really a new event, a new quality of conferences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Knopflacher, and also thank you so much